On the map, southwest of China, lies Tibet, a vast land surrounded by the towering Himalayan mountains, sitting nearly 14,000 feet above sea level. It's often called the roof of the world. The landscape is breathtaking, with serene valleys, glacial rivers, turquoise lakes, waterfalls, and snow-capped peaks. Geographically, Tibet is a part of China, but politically, its status is quite different from mainland China. It's classified as an autonomous region, which means it has limited self-rule under Chinese sovereignty. While a few other Chinese regions like Xinjiang, Ningxia, Inner Mongolia, and Guangxi also hold the same autonomous title, Tibet stands apart. Globally, no other Chinese region draws as much debate, controversy, and diplomatic attention as Tibet does. And there's a long history behind that. For centuries, Tibet existed under the influence of both the Chinese and Mongol empires. But everything changed in 1912, when the Qing dynasty collapsed after the Xinhai Revolution and the Republic of China was founded. Taking advantage of the chaos, Tibetan nationalists expelled Chinese forces from the region and declared Tibet an independent state once again. Then came 1949. Mao Zedong's communist forces overthrew the Republic of China and established the People's Republic of China. A fierce opponent of separatist movements, Mao declared that Tibet had always been part of China and vowed to reincorporate it into the new communist state. In September 1950, Beijing invited Tibetan officials for talks to settle Tibet's political status. But Tibetan leaders refused. The next month, in October 1950, around 80,000 troops of the People's Liberation Army entered Tibet and took control of several key cities. Amid this crisis, a 15-year-old boy named Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, was appointed as Tibet's head of state. The following year, in 1951, a Tibetan delegation traveled to Beijing for negotiations. The result was the 17-point agreement, under which Tibet accepted Chinese sovereignty in exchange for autonomy within the People's Republic of China. The treaty guaranteed protection of Tibet's Buddhist religion, culture, and traditions, and promised that the Dalai Lama's political authority would remain untouched. On paper, it looked like peace. But the reality was far more complicated. During the Cold War era, between 1951 and 1959, the CIA and India's Intelligence Bureau began covertly training Tibetan freedom fighters and guerrilla units in the Himalayan region. The goal, driven by Cold War dynamics, was to contain the spread of communism and support local resistance against Chinese forces through limited sabotage and ambush operations. By 1959, tensions had reached a breaking point. Protests and unrest swept across Tibet, especially in Lhasa. On March 9, 1959, Chinese troops surrounded the city. Many Tibetans believed the Chinese government was planning to arrest or abduct the Dalai Lama. In his defense, thousands of people gathered around the Potala Palace, forming human shields and launching anti-China protests. What began as demonstrations soon turned into a full-blown uprising as Tibetan rebels clashed with the People's Liberation Army. Chinese authorities later claimed that CIA-trained fighters were also involved in the violence. Fearing for his safety, the Dalai Lama, advised by his inner circle, disguised himself and escaped from the Potala Palace on March 17, 1959, along with a few family members. The Chinese military chased him, but failed to catch him. On March 26th, he crossed into India's Arunachal Pradesh region at Tawang and requested political asylum from Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, who accepted the request. Meanwhile, back in Lhasa, Chinese forces launched a brutal crackdown. Hundreds of Chinese soldiers and thousands of Tibetan rebels and civilians were killed. The uprising was crushed mercilessly. On March 28, 1959, China took full control of Lhasa, dissolved the Tibetan government, and abolished the Kashag, the Dalai Lama's Supreme Council. A month later, on April 29, 1959, the Dalai Lama established the Central Tibetan Administration, also known as the Tibetan Government in Exile, in the Indian city of Dharamshala. He has led it for the past 66 years. But this conflict isn't just about the current Dalai Lama. It's also about the future, and the question of who will become the next Dalai Lama once the current one, now 90 years old, passes away. Beijing is already preparing to appoint its own chosen successor, while the United States and its allies are pushing to keep China out of that process. Before we get to what might happen next, it's worth understanding who the Dalai Lama actually is, and how this sacred position has been chosen through history. The title Dalai Lama means Ocean of Wisdom. It represents the highest spiritual authority in Tibetan Buddhism. Within the hierarchy of Tibetan monastic life, the followers, male monks and female nuns, dedicate their lives to spreading and practicing the teachings of Buddha. Above them are higher lamas, then the tulkus, and then the karmapas, each level representing spiritual masters and heads of monasteries. Beyond them sits the Panchen Lama, the second highest spiritual authority after the Dalai Lama himself. The Panchen Lama traditionally plays a central role in identifying and approving the next Dalai Lama. Politically, the Dalai Lama is assisted by a supreme governing council called the Kashag, along with the Panchen Lama, both of whom help oversee the key affairs of the Tibetan administration. But in all major decisions, both spiritual and political, the Dalai Lama's word remains final. Just like Hinduism and Jainism, Buddhism also believes in reincarnation, the idea that when a person dies, their soul is reborn into a new body. This concept becomes especially significant when it comes to the position of the Dalai Lama. According to centuries-old Tibetan tradition, before the Dalai Lama passes away, he leaves behind spiritual hints and indicates certain regions where his next reincarnation might take place. After his death, a special search committee made up of high lamas begins a spiritual investigation. They travel across the indicated regions, looking for children who might possess the same traits and characteristics as the late Dalai Lama. The shortlisted children are then brought to Lhasa, where they undergo evaluation and spiritual training. Through a series of tests, religious consultations, rituals, and under the guidance of the Panchen Lama, the next Dalai Lama is eventually selected. By the end of the 18th century, the Qing dynasty, seeking to tighten control over Tibet, introduced the 29-article ordinance. This decree not only restructured Tibet's administrative system, but also brought a major change to how high lamas, including the Panchen Lama and Dalai Lama, would be chosen. From then on, a new practice called the Golden Urn was introduced. The Golden Urn was a brass vessel owned by the Tibetan authority under the Qing Empire. Whenever there was disagreement over the short list of potential candidates for a high religious position, the names were placed inside this urn, and the final choice was made by drawing lots. Over time, dozens of high lamas, 2 Panchen lamas, and even 1 Dalai Lama have been selected using this very method. After the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1912, the Golden Urn remained under the control of the Tibetan authority, free from any Chinese influence. However, after Tibet's annexation by the People's Republic of China in 1951, the urn once again came under the supervision of Chinese-controlled Tibetan authorities. The Golden Urn is now considered China's first trump card in its effort to control the selection of the next Dalai Lama. But China has another card up its sleeve as well, the current Panchen Lama. His story, too, is filled with mystery and controversy. In 1989, after the death of the 10th Panchen Lama, the Dalai Lama announced from Dharamshala in May 1995 that a 6-year-old boy from Tibet had been recognized as the 11th Panchen Lama. But just 2 days later, that boy and his family disappeared. To this day, 30 years later, their whereabouts remain unknown. The Central Tibetan Authority accuses the Chinese government of abducting them, and the Dalai Lama's followers continue to recognize that boy as the true Panchen Lama, holding annual ceremonies in his memory. China, however, refused to acknowledge that choice. In December 1995, the Chinese government used the Buddhist Association of China and the Golden Urn method to appoint its own Panchen Lama. The Dalai Lama and his followers rejected this appointment as illegitimate. Interestingly, this Beijing-backed Panchen Lama has, for the past 15 years, been a member of China's top political advisory body. To counter China's growing regional and global influence, the United States has increasingly used Tibet as part of its broader geopolitical strategy, often under the banners of human rights and religious freedom. Through this issue, Washington keeps steady diplomatic pressure on Beijing and has even imposed various political and non-political sanctions on Chinese officials and institutions involved in Tibet. In 2024, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Resolve Tibet Act, urging China to reopen dialogue with the Dalai Lama to find a lasting solution to the Tibet issue. The act also reaffirmed America's full commitment to the Tibetan people's religious freedom and right to self-determination, declaring that the U.S. stands firmly with them on every international platform. Beijing, however, strongly rejects this stance, calling Tibet an integral and sovereign part of China and labeling the Dalai Lama a separatist leader who threatens China's territorial integrity. The Chinese government insists that Tibet is purely an internal matter and that it will never accept any form of foreign interference. Meanwhile, the Dalai Lama has said that the signs for his reincarnation point to his next life taking place outside Chinese control, possibly in a free country. He has even suggested that the next Dalai Lama could be chosen democratically, and that any Chinese involvement would make the process invalid. In a 2004 interview with Time magazine, he went so far as to say that it's up to the Tibetan people to decide whether they even need another Dalai Lama, implying that he could very well be the last. There's another surprising twist to this story, one that connects it to Mongolian Buddhism. In Mongolia, the spiritual leader of Buddhism is called the Gebtsundamba Kutugtu, a position that ranks just below the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama in the Buddhist hierarchy. In 2016, the Dalai Lama identified a child as the 10th Gebtsundamba, and that child happens to be an American citizen. Although the boy's parents are ethnically Mongolian Buddhists, many speculate that he might play a crucial role in the selection of the next Dalai Lama. Having an American citizen positioned within the upper ranks of global Buddhist leadership could have far-reaching geopolitical implications in the future. As things stand, it seems almost certain that for the first time in history, there will be two Dalai Lamas, one backed by Beijing and the other by the Dalai Lama's government in exile in India. When that happens, Tibet's spiritual and political question will become even more complex and divisive. What's your take on this? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Asia's most fascinating conflicts, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more such insights.